President Trump has deployed the National Guard and Marines to California against the wishes of the governor and the LA mayor.
Yeah, CNN senior political reporter Stephen Collins says Donald Trump is taking steps to justify using the U.S. military all over the country. Stephen writes, Trump is conjuring a narrative of invasion and insurrection. He's exaggerating disorder, and he's implying that to keep the country safe, he's ready to deploy soldiers across the country. And Stephen Collinson joins us now. And Stephen, I would go even a bit further by finishing that sentence, so brilliantly written as always and thoughtful by you, by saying that the president is sort of daring any opposition in his way to do just that, to stand in his way. He really does think that not only does he have the power to do this, but he has the support of the majority of the country, or if nothing else, his voters.
Yes, I think that's right. And it is very, I think, it fits with Trump's instincts. He likes to show force. He wants to use every accoutrement of the presidency to establish his dominance. And in this case, what he's done is he's exaggerated the crisis in Los Angeles, which is quite well contained within a few city blocks. And he's creating this narrative that the city is on fire, that he's stopped it from being burnt to the ground, and therefore the remedy to restore public order is the introduction of troops. That is something that is very familiar from autocratic nations in Latin America or Asia or the Middle East. So to some extent here, I think the president is playing with fire. It's a political image that he likes, that he's strong, that he's responding, that his supporters like, but he's also lifting the lid on tensions and exacerbating tensions. And when protests start and you put troops in the middle of those protests, things can mushroom in ways that you cannot control and that aren't predictable and can have very grave consequences.
I mean, and it goes beyond that, because he's also essentially intimating that Governor Newsom should be arrested. And when you think about the parade that is set to take place on Saturday, he is telling people not to protest in Washington, D.C., not to protest the military parade, which also coincides with his birthday. And, there's so many sort of hints and sparks of authoritarianism in that as well. I mean, just give us your take on just all of these protests that we're seeing around the country, particularly in LA, coinciding with what we're about to see on Saturday, this military parade in Washington, D.C.
Yes, what is happening is that the U.S. Army, whose 250th birthday it is, has now been dragged into this highly politicized situation. Yesterday, the president went down to one of the biggest military bases in the country at Fort Bragg in North Carolina, stood in front of massed ranks of troops and delivered an exceedingly politicized message talking about the need to use military force on domestic U.S. soil. This is something we hadn't seen before for generations. It's something that's completely antithetical with Republican Democratic government. Now, you can argue, and some people do, that you shouldn't take Trump literally, that a lot of this is hyperbole. It's for political effect. But cast your mind back 5 years. What we're seeing now is not that much different from what Trump did after the election in 2020, when he spread this false conspiratorial narrative that the election was stolen. That resulted in a real insurrection, one against the U.S. Capitol building by his supporters. And that, in its turn, created a base for his political comeback. So he is a very skilled demagogue. I would argue he's the most skilled demagogue in American history. And he is unleashing forces that could lead to quite a dark place when you consider how his last presidency ended.
Stephen, could you not make the argument that he's also goading Democrats here into falling into a position where they feel that they have to defend some of these protesters? I mean, you're already having the mayor of Los Angeles impose a curfew, and the governor unequivocally condemn the violence and looting and those who are breaking the law. It is a difficult and at times tricky position for Democrats to walk and be put in wanting to say to Americans that on the one hand they respect and are protecting their constitutional rights, but at the same time not defending necessarily the images that they're seeing play out on their city streets.
That's right. And this, of course, is one of the great perils of disinformation and the way that Trump creates alternative realities. If you look at your TV screens over the last few days, you see burning cars, you see soldiers facing down with rioters, police facing attacks and projectiles from demonstrators. That looks like a city that's completely out of control, even though the reality is that it isn't. Trump and his Republicans know by experience that the Democrats then, if they stand up and condemn the president for trying to send troops in and stand up to violence, that makes them look weak. There is a majority in the country. We don't know how enduring it will be, but for Trump's mass deportation program, so therefore Democrats are in somewhat of a weak position. The governor of California, Gavin Newsom, resolved that last night by doing an address to Californians when he said that democracy was now at a perilous moment. We'll see how that plays out, I think, across the country. But this, I think, is an example of how the immigration issue is so toxic and so emotive, the dangerous political reverberations that it has. You were talking to Nick there in England about the Northern Ireland violence also involving immigration. Across the world, the failure of center-left politicians to have a way to talk about immigration that is separate from the far-right populist message and to convince people is really causing great damage to liberal democracies. And immigration is a constant fuel, I think, for extremism and populism. And many left of center politicians across the world, not just in the United States, are struggling, I think, to find a way to talk about it in a way that's effective and a way that can quell some of this political damage.
Yeah, and with that speech last night, Gavin Newsom may be setting the stage for a presidential bid in 2028, perhaps as a new voice and leader for the Democratic Party. Stephen Collinson, thank you as always for joining us. And a reminder, you can read Stephen's article on CNN.com.
CNN's Josh Campbell joins us live now from Los Angeles. So, Josh, we're in the situation whereby you have the president essentially sending National Guard and Marines to LA, even though you have Gavin Newsom saying that they were not consulted. The city was not consulted at all. The governor was not consulted at all. And normally there's supposed to be some kind of coordination between the state, obviously, and the federal government. And then you have the situation whereby, according to LA officials and California officials, the deployment of the National Guard on the ground and the Marines training just outside the city is making a bad situation, a problematic situation, even worse. Give us your take on what is happening on the ground there.
Yeah, great to be with you. You know, it's never a good thing when politics and public safety come into tension. This is a full-on collision. You have this battle of words that's taking place in public between President Donald Trump and the state's governor here, Gavin Newsom, because they have very different agendas. Obviously, the president looked at some of the protests here. His administration decided that they didn't believe that local officials were doing enough. And so, as you mentioned, he did federalize the state's National Guard in order to protect federal property here in California. But it's an important point that you mentioned, and one that I hear so often from law enforcement sources here on the ground. They're concerned that the very presence of military troops here in LA is actually fueling a lot of the protests that we've seen, serving as an accelerant, if you will. While officials are trying to get this under control, they believe that that they can and have gotten it under control, particularly with the institution of a curfew last night. They continue to say that sending additional forces, particularly active duty U.S. Marines, to Los Angeles will only make this go on for even longer.
Josh, we're so lucky to have you here at CNN for a number of reasons, but in light of this specific story, you have a background in law enforcement. Just from your own personal expertise, tell us what is and isn't warranted at this time in terms of presence, military presence on the ground.
Well, it's thank you for the compliment. It's interesting because the president is saying that the National Guard kept Los Angeles from being completely obliterated in his view, which does not square with the facts. In fact, the National Guard here isn't really doing that much. They're standing guard outside of a federal building downtown. They've been seen protecting immigration agents as they're around town. But all of the public safety effort we're seeing to try to get this under control is largely coming from local police. And that's important because the police are the ones who are highly trained in crowd control, in de-escalation, in using non-lethal force in order to try to quell any potential uprisings that we've seen here. The military doesn't get that same type of training. In fact, as you mentioned, we've seen on helicopter affiliate footage around Los Angeles where you see Marines that are actually training for crowd control because they don't have that type of training. They're undergoing that right now. We're seeing them on video, practicing arrests, practicing, detaining people and the like. It's just a volatile situation when you have Marines whose job, on a normal day is working overseas, in wars and, often using lethal force. To have them now on the streets of a city interacting with fellow citizens. I hear from law enforcement sources here every day. I've heard since these kicked off on Friday, these protests, that is a potential recipe for disaster when you have that type of force that's coming in that's not trained. It could go south pretty quickly.